everyone, welcome to the Mariah Jean Fit YouTube channel. I'm Coach Mariah. Make sure you like our videos, subscribe to our channel, and share our videos as much as possible so we can reach a broader audience. We appreciate your support and enjoy the video. Hello and welcome to another vlog on YouTube and podcast on Spotify by the Fit Minds podcast. Coach Mariah here. Today we're going to be discussing the topic of chronic dieting and why it's just not working for you. I will also preface this podcast with a warning that there may be potential triggers for those who struggle with eating disorders or disordered eating patterns, such as binge eating disorder and/or anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, orthorexia, and even obsessively over-exercising or even overeating disorder as well. So there's quite a few there to be aware of. I am also not a qualified psychologist in that I'm unable to treat eating disorders directly, which is quite a misconception, I suppose, in this industry, is that nutritionists and dietitians, we don't necessarily specialize in eating disorders. Some will, some dietitians will, but nutritionists not so much, because it is more so a disorder of the mind, a psychiatric illness. Yes, it does involve food, but because I'll be discussing topics about chronic dieting, this will definitely relate back to disordered eating behaviours, and perhaps even for some people who are already diagnosed or maybe might need to be diagnosed. It's one of those things where this will be very general information regarding dieting, and certainly that I wouldn't want to trigger anybody who is currently suffering with an eating disorder. So, but this podcast will be very, very helpful for those who are seeking out assistance and information with regards to the dieting impacts physiologically on the body. I definitely can, though, touch on the topics associated with disordered eating behaviours and some of the warning signs of chronic dieting and the potential impacts on our health and well-being long term. So this will not be a specific type of treatment or anything for those who are suffering or think they may potentially have some disordered eating behaviours, but more so going to be a general rule of thumb as to the impacts of long-term chronic dieting on the body and the mind. So what does it look like? Firstly, I'm going to define what chronic dieting looks like, and if you find some of these warning signs may apply to you, then strap in for an episode that may possibly change your life or somebody else's life for the better. It may present as some or many of the following red flags: constantly seeking to follow a calorie deficit, a new diet, or restrict your calories without necessarily knowing why you continue to do so. Having a fear of increasing calories to maintenance or a surplus level, in fear of fat or weight gain. A fear of eating more food of any kind, such as a fear of feeling full or shame associated with increasing calories out of a dieting phase. Restricting or reducing your calories well below the recommended amount from a coach, nutritionist, or dietitian. Binging or snacking constantly while dieting, or restricting calories, especially when they are lower or after longer periods of dieting. So often we'll find that when we do see constant snacking and binging and the like, sometimes it is going to be more behavioural, and this is where it'll be more of a psychological aspect. But then we also see that some of it might be in relation to physiological factors. Perhaps the deficit might be a little bit too low. Insisting on staying in a calorie deficit for weeks on end and even months on end without taking diet breaks, even though they've been recommended to you. Even continuing to restrict well past your dieting phase should have ended. So well past when it should have ended. Finding it difficult to and even avoiding taking the diet breaks which are allocated to you. So not only are you, not following them, but you're even avoiding them. You're avoiding talking about them. You are having negative feelings associated to taking a diet break, for example. Associating consuming more calories or even more food volume. So, looking at bigger meals instead of small snacks and small meals. Looking at them negatively, no matter what the caloric content of those meals are. You just think that, well, a big meal must be terrible for me. But even so, consuming more calories in general and associating a negative connotation instead of the positive influences of consuming more calories for energy availability, for example. A belief that you need to remain on a restrictive diet or lower calories to maintain your physique. This is probably the most common misconception in relation to people dieting continuously past the point of being required, whereby I've even done it. 10 years ago, I was the person who kept restricting my calories, thinking that I didn't, or couldn't increase them without some sort of fat gain. And so this is where the binge eating and bulimia and anorexia came into play, where there was a lot of guilt involved. So weirdly enough, my own eating disorders, yes, as much as they were psychological and psychiatric issues, certainly developed originally from severe restriction and a fear of increasing calories because of a fear of body fat gain. Being triggered by small weight changes on that note from day to day, throwing off an entire mood and mindset, often resulting in further calorie restriction or even food group restriction, or even binging as self-punishment or sabotage. I can't tell you, and this is going to be the penny drop statement of this entire podcast, how many women have triggered themselves into binge eating or starving themselves because they've had a weight fluctuation in relation to their period. They've gone into a luteal phase right before their period. We've all done it when they've had a 1 to 1.5 kilo spike, or maybe you haven't dropped for the week and you start panicking thinking that your diet isn't working and you've got to restrict yourself, or you feel extremely guilty as if you haven't been doing something right, and then you end up binging. So this is the game changer. We get fluid increases from our periods and when we are due for our periods. And when people have this type of information under their belt, they can think of this fluid and this weight change that can happen often overnight, even if you've been following your calories. They can think of it less emotionally, which I believe can be a secret to unlocking this more of a knowledge, I suppose, or more conclusive knowledge of our own cycles, as opposed to having this real bias to my weight increased and therefore I must be a terrible person, I must have done something wrong. Glorifying clean eating only. Again, another common type of behavior I see is this: I can't consume any sort of processed foods at all. So only consuming clean foods, both while dieting and in everyday life. Feeling shame for having any processed or packaged foods at all. Not being able to eat a meal out with family and friends outside of something like a comp prep. Avoiding social situations in fear of having to eat over your calorie intake. Or not knowing what's in what you're eating. So having that fear in relation to, I don't know how to count these calories because I don't know what they've cooked this meal with, whether they've used oils, etc., how much they used, and all of a sudden you can almost experience this intense anxiety in those situations, which is a sign of disordered eating behavior, especially if you're not able to live life and incorporate these flexible meals in small amounts, obviously, if you're dieting, but for special occasions. Outside of comp prep, obviously, it's not something we do in comp prep ourselves, but for everyday people, if you are avoiding eating out altogether for months and months and months and months on end for no particular reason other than I just want to lose body fat, this is a warning sign that we are getting a little bit too focused on being as strict as possible with calorie intake. Constantly feeling flat, tired, run down, and getting brain fog after dieting for longer periods, but simply pushing through because you think this is normal. Getting accustomed to and even addicted to feeling drained and burnt out, and having an illogical fear of increasing calories, increasing micronutrient uptake, and resting more to nurture the body. So I see this a lot with women, especially those who've been doing it for quite some time, is that they like the feeling of feeling exhausted, and they think that that is what equates to getting something done, getting a result, right? So you have to feel like crap. It's not the case. There is a safe way of doing it. And certainly as well, resting is not bad for you, and it doesn't mean you're going to gain body fat. Again, I was that person 10 years ago who didn't rest. I would walk to the gym, which was not close. It took me an hour and a half to get to the gym. To do a yoga class on my rest day, but the yoga class was quite intensive. And if anything, I was still exercising. I was still purposefully exercising on that day. Getting accustomed to that feeling as well, on that note, getting accustomed to feeling drained, feeling exhausted, etc., can be an addiction in itself. So it can be a stress addiction whereby we almost thrive off the feeling of that fight or flight type of mode, and where our adrenal function is completely shot. So I've spoken about this in previous podcasts, but sometimes the disordered eating can go hand in hand with this over-exercising. They can be paired with it, engaging in excess cardio or hours upon hours in the gym, double or triple exercise sessions daily, which are absolutely unnecessary and often counterproductive. Unless you are an elite athlete like a professional footballer and you need to be doing a cardio session in the morning and you need to be doing a weights training session in the afternoon. But even so, if you are going to be doing that and you are a professional footballer, you will still need to fuel those energy requirements adequately. And most of these boys, especially the big fellas, if you're a lady who plays, that's totally fine. But they're going to be refueling quite heavily for these double sessions. And so you'll often see that they'll be underfeeding and underfueling. And I see this more in women than men, double sessions, people trying to even make up for other sessions as well and burning themselves out as a result, especially if they're not adequately fueling those sessions. Sadly, to wrap this up as well, and I guess there's going to be many symptoms and signs of chronic dieting and chronic dieters as a type of, certainly a type of dieter, I would say, or even, I wouldn't even say it's a personality trait. I think they're behaviours that people get stuck in. It's sadly often paired with body dysmorphia or severe feelings of poor self-esteem and self-image or self-worth. So when we talk about eating disorders, and this is not something that, you know, professionally I can treat, as I said, but going through my own recovery when I was much younger, there was a common misconception that eating disorders were more about the food than they were about anything else. And it's actually psychological mostly, it's psychiatric mostly. So a lot of that work, especially in recovery from these diseases and conditions, is going to be, you know, in the psychological realm. So this is where a lot of people are not getting the right help. They're going to coaches perhaps, and, you know, I'm not the right person to see if you've got a deeply seated eating disorder. Yes, maybe after your recovery and you've got clearance and everything like that, but it's so important to understand that it is a psychological problem and something that, you know, you need to reach out to get help for. So I'll talk about that later in the podcast on how you can do that. So let's talk about the negative impacts. Often it's assumed that constantly dieting is the healthiest approach to your fitness, body composition, and health markers. You know, everybody seems to glorify dieting as if it's the only way. You know, you must always be on a diet, and if you're not on a diet, you're a terrible person, and when you're back on a diet, you're a great person. There's this very black and white way of thinking. However, there are a plethora of concerns and risks involved for bouts of long-term dieting, or even restricting calories to lower than required for your own personalized calorie deficit values. So, you know, most people do not understand that their calorie deficit is not going to be the same as the next person's The first concern is that of nutrient deficiencies, whereby we already see a reduction in overall micronutrient uptake whilst dieting. So this is really important to understand. With a lower caloric intake in general, and this is often not known as well, or even, I guess, assumed, but with a lower caloric intake in general, it can often be seen that women especially are at risk of developing deficiencies of essential nutrients such as calcium, iron, iodine, sodium chloride, selenium, vitamins A, B, C, E, and K, and even deficiencies in magnesium and zinc, amongst others. So it's not just going to be the ones I listed, but certainly many more that you can be at risk of developing deficiencies too, with low calories and also with poor choices in food in those low calorie intakes. But even then, even if you've got whole foods and you're ticking all the boxes and you're clean eating the whole way through, you're still going to eventually develop some sort of deficiency inevitably from long-term dieting. And it's simply because you just don't have enough food on board to reach your intake, your goals, your micronutrient goals. Essentially, obviously with reduced total food volume, so if you think about it, you can't fit as many things into your diet. Yes, fruits and vegetables are particularly low in calories, but you know, if you only have a certain amount of calories to work with, you can't have 6 bananas, can you? Not that you need them, but there's going to be a limit as to what you can fit into your diet, even with variety. Whether or not you're going to be able to get variety from lots of different types of fruits and vegetables will depend on your food choices, obviously, whilst dieting. But even then, you can still miss out on some of those. And long term, it does take time for a deficiency to develop. But that's the interesting concept, is that if you do this for long enough, if you deprive calories for long enough, it will eventually arise. We also see inhibited absorption and uptake of the essential nutrients consumed. When the body is in a state of stress, continuous stress specifically, and also lower body fat levels, we do see a reduction in ability to absorb micronutrients. And this is where we're finding big problems with women, is that women are just not hitting their micronutrients. And men as well, obviously. Men are very, I suppose, opposed to eating fruits and vegetables. But specifically for those who are heavy dieters, we see that they're actually probably more malnourished than anything. And it doesn't have to come down to just less calories and less energy to use, right? But as I said, it comes down to less micronutrients in general. If you've listened to any of my other podcasts, you'll understand that the impacts of deficiencies on the human body and hormonal balance can be detrimental to a person's health, affecting mental health, well-being, energy levels, libido, digestion, immune function, muscle recovery, bone density, menstrual cycles for women specifically, and brain function as well. So memory can be impacted, but there's more symptoms in this than you'll experience, right? So there's more than I've listed. But there is literally going to be so many things. Hair loss, you're going to have, long term. You're going to have things like skin problems as well. Your teeth are going to eventually become brittle. Your nails become brittle. So it impacts so much more. Even your sight is going to be impacted, especially in cases of extreme deficiencies of particular micronutrients. So, I'll list them off now. Even more of those nitty-gritty ones, but deficiencies of all sorts of essential nutrients can result in surfacing a wide variety of symptoms, diseases, and illnesses, including but not limited to lethargy, poor recovery, muscle twitches, high blood pressure, issues with vision, impaired cognitive function, low blood pressure, dry skin, brittle bones, depression, anxiety, and poor digestion. Headaches, nausea, trouble with urination, abnormally low testosterone in men, abnormally low or high estrogen or progesterone in women, delayed menstrual cycles in youth and also in females as well. But I'm talking about delayed primary amenorrhea. What we call primary amenorrhea is when a female's menstrual cycle is delayed when they are younger. So they don't actually get it for until much later in their life. And that's not a healthy thing. It needs to be known. It is not healthy. Sometimes there'll be some genetic factors in play, but it's not healthy for a female to be getting her cycle much later in life. And there's going to be a reason as to why that's happening, especially if she's an athlete and she's underfeeding, if she's not eating enough food and obviously not getting that wide array of micronutrients. And even so, we see this more so with vegan and vegetarian athletes now than ever. Also things like dysmenorrhea, amenorrhea, which is obviously going to include the primary amenorrhea and the second amenorrhea, which is missing cycles of those who have already got a cycle. And irregular cycles, dysmenorrhea, oligomenorrhea. So you've got things like painful periods and also periods that go for different types of lengths. So you might have one that goes for 14 days and maybe one that goes for 3. So this is where they're not going to be the right length. And also these really painful periods, especially those who have chronic diseases and conditions. Some nutrient deficiencies can exacerbate these. Crazy, right? Reduced fertility in men and women. Yes, micronutrient deficiencies, if you're not eating enough fruits and vegetables, and certainly if you're not eating enough calories in general, can actually affect your fertility. Wild. Frequent bouts of sickness and yes, even cancer in some cases. Okay, so if you are under consuming calories over a prolonged period of time, then you develop a micronutrient deficiency, you may not be actually consuming enough micronutrients to battle and prevent cancerous cells from developing. Oh my God, that's crazy. And yes, a nutritional deficiency can arise due to long bouts of dieting or lower calories than required. So it's not just about not eating the right things, but also eating less food for longer. Especially if a person's dietary choices have not been overseen or audited by a professional such as a nutritionist or dietitian. You might be thinking you're eating super clean, eating chicken and broccoli and rice and everything's dandy, but that's only going to cover a certain amount of micronutrients. And if you're missing out on vital micronutrients like vitamin C, vitamin E, and even vitamin K, even if you're eating broccoli, you're not going to be getting the full micronutrient profile. And our bodies don't necessarily like receiving the same foods over and over again. So having food variety in your day specifically is so important, especially when you're dieting. Deficiencies take time to develop, as I said, each on a slightly different scale than the other, and this will vary from person to person as well. But with lower energy availability, EA, as referred to in the sports nutrition world, for prolonged periods, we also see impacts on sports performance, your weights workouts, for example, your cardio bouts, and even, yes, team sports. And this is whereby consuming as little as possible calorie-wise isn't always key when attempting a fat loss phase. Simply eating less and moving more is not always the clean-cut answer, and this is something we hear quite a lot in the fitness industry, is you just need to exercise more and eat less. And unfortunately, this blanket statement can often impact people in negative ways more so than we'd realise. A calorie deficit value and even macro breakdown will differ from person to person depending on many factors, including height, weight, age, total lean body mass, daily incidental activity levels, genetics, and of course exercise energy expended from the body, amongst a few others. As explained in previous podcasts, this is a value that should be calculated and determined for you by a professional sports nutritionist or dietitian only, as there are many factors in play when crunching the final numbers. And this may be reliant on a few things. You may have, for example, a few genetic outliers, which means that your calories just need to be higher than what a person might even be able to calculate for you. You're only going to know this if you work with somebody over a period of weeks and months, as opposed to just getting some numbers on the internet. And this is where we see that commonly people will make that mistake. They'll find a calorie calculator on the internet and go, yep, this is my deficit. And it's not always the case that it's going to be accurate. For some people, it could be hundreds of calories out, depending on how their body responds to that deficit. For myself, for example, my deficits are actually weirdly a lot higher than what the calculators spit out. And so as sports nutritionists, yes, we have our calculators that we use. Do we use that as an absolute value? Absolutely not. We look at your rate of loss, your energy levels, etc. Things like your sleep being impacted, all that type of stuff, and we actually make a determination from there onwards. So we need to work with you for a little bit longer than just a couple of seconds to give you a value that we can, determine from crunching those numbers. But in essence, it can vary from person to person. It's not going to be an exact numerical science. Some of it is going to be dependent on the individual's response and experience of that deficit type of number and value. And also, some people can be adapted to lower calories, so that if we, for example, then, don't have the information that they've been dieting for a prolonged period of time, and we put them into a deficit of what we think is their deficit, we then might see no response at all from that calorie deficit. So this is where we need to increase calories for a little bit. It might be a few weeks at a time, depending on the dieting phase that they took previously, and then we can recommence the dieting afterwards. So it's quite interesting, but it's not just a simple case of here's my deficit calories and off I go. The sweet spot will actually represent what's called a relative deficit. When we find that spot that does work, we've got a nice steady rate of loss for you, and you don't seem to be starving every day, which allows for healthy and sustainable rate of loss, right? So it's not just as much as possible is healthy and is going to be beneficial. There's actually a point where rate of loss is too high for that particular person. Protecting energy systems as much as possible in this process as well, ensuring micronutrient demands are kept intact as well. So, I've seen a lot of people try and go low carb, and interestingly enough, they're like, why do I feel dizzy and kind of like I've got no energy and I feel flat all the time? It's like, well, there is a minimum amount of carbohydrates that your body actually requires to function optimally, even in a calorie deficit. And whereby in this process, we keep hunger hormones as low as possible. You're obviously still going to be hungry somewhat in a deficit. You don't need to be starving. And then we're less likely to have those driving you to eat your entire kitchen in one sitting, which long-term is going to see you achieve your result far more effectively than depriving on really low calories and then potentially binging or overeating your set calories, right? So wouldn't you rather just sit a little bit above that in a more sustainable type of approach and level where you can stick to your diet, where you can, feel like you're somewhat satisfied after your meals, still lose body fat, but not take extreme measures where you end up on a giant fat loss binge and diet heavily type of roller coaster. And even then in the binge episodes, again, this is where a lot of people, they've got no idea what they're actually over consuming. So, how do you know that your calories need to be that low unless you actually try to have them just a touch higher, trust a professional, and see where that can take you. Metabolic adaptation is another risk posed with long-term bouts of chronic dieting, especially with lower levels of calories than required. This is often referred to as a slowing metabolism. My metabolism has slowed down, love that one. Not technically correct. It's not quite what occurs for the individual during a state of adaptation, but the concept pertains to the idea that we see a slowing of energy use, so energy expenditure from the body slows down, it's reduced. And in turn, at times, reduced fat loss capabilities if you think about it, right? If we're expending less energy, we have less of an ability to use fat stores because we're just not using as much energy. Our body adapts to all sorts of stimuli and environments, including exercise, temperature, climate, and many more. An adaptation we don't often consider is that of our caloric intake. Our energy availability from food consumed will often determine the energy of which our body is willing to also part with. You know, if you put a certain amount of fuel in the car can only go so far with that fuel. If you have less fuel in the car, and even so, if you do that for a prolonged period of time and you run it on almost empty for a prolonged period of time, do you think that the car is going to respond very well to that? Probably not. Shouldn't really use cars as a comparison to human beings, but we see it in the animal kingdom as well in different ways because we don't have the same metabolism as what lots of different breeds of animals do, but certainly in that after prolonged periods of time without enough energy, that they all have these kind of built-in defense mechanisms to take care of their energy and preserve their energy just in case they don't get any more food anytime soon. So that's what it is, okay? And yes, we do have additional fat stores, of course, that we can also tap into as energy, but the process is just not that simple in that our fat stores are not as bioavailable as an energy source, right, as we would like to think. We do require some carbohydrates for brain function and energy production, but we also utilize carbohydrates in the process called the Krebs cycle, which actually uses carbohydrates to tap into fat stores quite effectively from adipose tissue, especially when entering into moderate to high intensity heart rate zones, okay? Whereby in high heart rate zones, we're going to predominantly be using carbohydrates, but still at some point it will tap into, fat stores. And in those moderate zones, you'll see a combination of both. Okay, this is why weights training is fantastic for fat loss, but we do need some sort of carbohydrates to be able to fuel that process. There is a minimum and vastly differing requirement of carbohydrate intake for each individual to meet an optimal EA for their endeavors without impacting their performance and in turn energy expenditure. And if you think about it, all micronutrients that are on, for example, on a plant-based level, we actually get from carbohydrates. So if you start cutting carbs, you then eventually end up with much less of a micronutrient profile than your body requires. Vegetables, they're a carbohydrate. Fruits, they're a carbohydrate. It's really important to understand that there are crucial micronutrients in fruits and vegetables we cannot live without. So if you cut your carbs down to next to nothing, you are not only going to have less than desirable energy and you're going to feel like absolute crap, but you're also eventually going to develop a micronutrient deficiency. So basically with less energy available to expend, less energy available that we've consumed to expend energy, the response from the body isn't always as willing as we'd prefer, in that metabolic systems and heart rate can be impacted as somewhat of a defense mechanism, as I mentioned previously, to reduce energy output, and protect the human body from harm, because we use fat stores as kind of like something that when we get sick, for example, we need fat stores to be able to access as an energy source, and that we often do. But we need fat stores as a backup system, really. That's what fat stores are kind of designed for, but also for fueling intense exercise, alongside carbohydrates. So if you think about it, if we start to get a little bit low with all that, our fuel starts to run low, our body fat maybe even starts to run lower, what do you think is the defense mechanism to protect us from death? Because eventually if we lose enough body fat and strip it off our organs in our brain and our heart, we die, and there are cases of this happening to people with eating disorders, which is quite frightening. So it's a defense mechanism, Metabolic adaptation, slowing metabolism, is a defense mechanism. Because of prolonged periods of dieting and the impacts, the physiological impact on the body is that your energy expenditure slightly slows down or is reduced, because your energy availability is reduced. And as a result, your body just doesn't want to part with as much energy. Underfeeding, and even so for longer periods, is experienced as a direct threat to the human body, Dieting is stressful to the human body, in that if we do not have access to food for prolonged periods of time in the wild, for example, we indeed have an inbuilt system to preserve energy for those times until more food is available for consumption. When we reach a period of time, which can be anywhere from 4 to 6 to 8 weeks onwards of dieting at a particular level of caloric intake, we can sometimes see a decline in muscular strength, endurance, and in turn then a reduced energy output, as I mentioned. So, it's going to impact more than just your magical metabolism. You're actually going to see the physiological and experience the physiological impacts of dieting, which are not going to be favorable. And that's okay. You know, in dieting, this does happen to a certain extent. So not everybody needs to panic and think that they need to increase their calories after 4 weeks if they're in a normal relative deficit. You know, if they're getting some symptoms of adaptation, that's totally fine. Because eventually too, you do need your body to adapt to some extent to dieting so that you're basically not starving all the time and that your sleep isn't disrupted through a dieting period. It's just that if it is prolonged, if it is something that drags on, we know that there's going to be a problem there. Especially if you've cut your own calories to as low as you think you need to go on, which is usually lower than what, like most people put themselves on lower calories than they actually need to be on. That's probably the most common mistake I see with people who are calculating their own deficits is they just go as low as possible and they tend to fail pretty miserably at that. So there's no coincidence that there's that kind of like, I'm starting my diet and then just failing and feeling terrible for it. You don't need to be that person. There is an easier way. So this is due to a number of reasons, obviously with the decrease in energy output, okay? Mostly being carbohydrate restriction, so that's the major macro, the reason why we get this adaptation occurring. It's carbs. You know, less carbs over time, eventually we end up with this adaptation. So we have less of them available, as I mentioned previously. They are used to fuel moderate to higher intensity exercise. Different people will have different adaptation points and some will even adapt and plateau with fat loss over weeks at a time. So you might see that, you know, for example, someone just plateaus for 5 or 6 weeks and nothing really happens. And, you know, some people might plateau a little bit and then, you know, you might have to just drop them down a little bit more. Or, for example, if a person has been dieting for a really prolonged period of time, they might need the opposite. You know, we need that information. You may need to increase calories, and that's where we talk about diet breaks and maintenance periods to do some metabolic repair, to actually have some metabolic repair there where we can start to reverse some of those adaptations and actually make the most of a deficit again. So obviously those people who do plateau over, you know, weeks and weeks at a time, they may wonder what's happened. This is whereby either the person has lost enough weight for their calorie deficit to have changed. So that's the other factor, is that when weight changes, your calorie deficit usually has to be reduced at some point. So if you've lost 10 kilos, your calorie deficit at 10 kilos heavier is not the same 10 kilos lighter. And the same would be maybe for the 5 kilo mark as well. Less so for smaller drops, but you know, it's not, your calorie deficit at 90 kilos is not going to be the same at 70. It's just not going to be the same calorie deficit because you're carrying less weight, which means you need less energy to move that body around. The bigger mass that we're working with, the more energy that you're going to be expending, and more muscle mass will also do something similar. So obviously this might mean that when someone's lost more weight, yes, they might need a reduction as they weigh less. You know, they expend less energy naturally because they're carrying less weight around. If I put a 10 kilo backpack on now, right, just forget about whether it's body fat or what it's made of. But if I put a 10 kilo backpack on my back, I'd be burning more energy walking around than I would without the backpack. So the same goes for weight. You know, when a person comes to me and they're 100 kilos and they go, I need to be on the same calories as somebody who's 60 or 70. No. Because you are in that higher weight range than the other person, this is why you should never compare calories. Because you're in that higher weight range, you actually require a higher calorie deficit than that person. If you're sedentary, you know, and the other person is really active, for example, you know, you might maybe at some point have similar calorie deficits, but at the same time, we're probably going to get you moving as well to try and, you know, push things along a little bit. So, you know, often it's assumed, and I have to try and convince women who are trying to lose quite a lot of body fat that their calorie deficit does not need to be as low as what they think it does. And I've often seen that this has been their demise. This has been the thing that's been leading them astray the whole time, is that they've been trying to cut their calories too low and all of a sudden they're just starving and they end up binging again, and it kind of repeats the cycle, and then it almost perpetuates this idea that they can't diet. I find that they can, as long as the deficit isn't too low, and then the calories are achievable and their hunger levels aren't through the roof and they're still losing body fat and they feel like they're accomplished and it's something that they can stick to. And it is their calorie deficit, it's designed for them. So I get very passionate about this because it is such a problem that we are dealing with, is that everybody thinks they need to be on 1,200 calories or 1,500 calories. I'm on, you know, 2,000 something calories at the moment and I'm in a deficit, you know, and I'm losing body fat at the moment. And it's interesting is like people go, oh my God, that's a lot of calories. I mean, yeah, I guess so. But at the same time, it's still not. For some people, my partner, he's on 4,000 something and losing body fat. We have different calorie deficits. We're different sexes. We're different, slightly different ages. We're different heights. We're different weights. You know, there's a lot to take into consideration as to what a person's calorie deficit might mean. And he's got a lot more muscle mass than me as well. So it should never be assumed the person might just need to drop their calories, right? This is the first thing that people assume rather than taking a diet break. And this is what really annoys me is like most people think, oh, I just have to drop my calories. You probably don't. You may not need to. So don't assume, never assume when it comes to calories that you need to do anything. Just speak to your professional and talk to them about where you've come from, what you've been doing previously, so they've got a good idea of how to map everything out. At times, it may in fact require the opposite approach, in that a diet break for 1 week or even numerous weeks may be required to restore metabolic function, increase energy availability, and reverse some negative implications of metabolic adaptation. Other signs of requiring a diet break will include particularly low energy levels, trouble sleeping over a prolonged period of time, reduced strength or performance, so regressing, especially if you're trying, as hard as possible to hit your previous weights. Food focus, strange food cravings, uncontrollable hunger, or even experiencing no hunger cues at all. Some of these are somewhat normal to experience intermittently. Don't get me wrong, not being hungry when you're in a calorie deficit eventually isn't that bad. But if, for example, you've been dieting for quite some time, you're plateaued, you're on pretty low calories and you're not hungry at all, like let's say you're on 1,300 calories, you're already on really low calories, you're not hungry at all, you're not dropping at all, and you might even be having trouble sleeping, concentrating, all that type of stuff, and maybe a lot of reduced strength in the gym, probably going to be that you're metabolically adapted and there needs to be some time to build you back up in your calories. Is that always possible in a comp prep scenario, for example? No. Why? We're working with a timeline. So sometimes we run out of time and we need to work with what we've got. So in those cases, it's a very different scenario. Often signs of requiring, as I mentioned, a diet break, alongside all of those low energy types of situations, you're also going to get some changes sometimes in personality as well, and the way you behave towards other people and even foods. As I said, food focus or having no food, not even thinking about food at all. But food focus isn't just thinking about food, but obsessing over food and thinking about lots of different food combinations and stuff like that. So that's why I was talking about the strange food cravings. This is precisely why having a professional on board for your journey and fearing diet breaks or maintenance calories once you've reached your goal is just not necessary. Stop arguing with people who are professionals, please. They are doing their best by you, and if you continue to argue with them saying things like, but if I increase my calories, I'll gain body fat, but when I get fat, I can't tell you how many times I've given someone a diet break and they've said to me, Mariah, I just don't think I can do it. I'm really worried. And I say to them, you know what? You'd think I'd done this before. 6 years I've been doing this. I've worked with hundreds of people and I've never had a person gain body fat in a diet break. It just doesn't happen. When you come out of a calorie deficit into maintenance, there is a middle ground. Deficit, maintenance, surplus. Maintenance in the middle is not a surplus. It's the amount of energy that you expend for the day currently, and you're matching that with your intake, which doesn't equate to fat gain, okay? You might get minor changes from day to day, but they tend to equal out. And usually when someone puts you on a diet break, they'll usually put you just below maintenance so that you don't end up spilling over some days and then, you know what I mean? Then you don't freak out. So it's just one of those things. Maintenance periods are required. They have a purpose. Please stop arguing with people about it. They care about you. They want the best for you. Their goal is for you to hit your goals. Just remember that. So next time you're given a diet break, okay, take one. Maintenance calories are not the same thing as a surplus. They're just not. And even so, if you've been recommended to sit in a surplus, if a coach has said, you know what, I think you need to go into a surplus for a period of time to grow muscle or improve sports performance, please take the recommendation on board, as there's probably a reason why your coach has recommended this. Small amounts of body fat gain in a surplus are not permanent. This is what's important to understand. I didn't realize this when I had anorexia. I was so afraid of body fat gain. It's like I thought it was like a tattoo. It's not permanent, okay? You can choose to lose whenever you want to, right? Whether that's going to be healthy for you is a very different case. But at the same time, becoming weight focused is not the same as fat loss focused. And I think when you differentiate the difference between the two, you understand that weight isn't the be all and end all, as I've mentioned in previous podcasts, but maybe a fat loss goal is the thing that you need to focus on. And that's why we look at physiques. We look at pictures, we look at photos, instead of being super focused on the scale. So, the periods of diet breaks are really handy to allow for increased energy availability and even to allow for more periods of balance and flexibility in your lifestyle and your food choices. These periods are also handy to help reduce food focus and repair your relationship with food and reduce hunger levels. Maintenance periods have their place, okay? And obviously, as I mentioned with fat loss, you'll eventually commence a fat loss phase, again, if you want to and when required, okay? There's plenty of time to do that. You don't have to constantly be lean. And I'm going to talk about this in another podcast I'm going to do, I believe, next week with a fellow coach, talking about not needing to maintain a lean physique all year round. So the periods of surpluses, maintenance or surplus, they serve a purpose, either for achieving muscle growth or for perhaps restoring that metabolic adaptation or that metabolic function. And the surplus, it serves a purpose for growing a serious amount of muscle, more than you'll ever grow in a calorie deficit or at maintenance. Now, the next point is that atrophy is a real risk, okay? So muscle wastage, atrophy, is a real risk when it comes to underfeeding for longer periods of time and more so when consuming calories well below your required deficit. Atrophy is something that women don't often think about. Men do, probably more than women, but atrophy occurs significantly in women as well because a lot of women, again, are just dieting for too long, doing too much cardio, just thrashing and bashing themselves and not thinking about the fact that you may not have glutes because you just haven't been eating enough. You haven't been eating enough food, or perhaps you may have been avoiding a protein intake for some weird reason. Glutes, muscle is built from protein. And this is where atrophy is a real risk. Binge eating cycles are all too commonly experienced as well, usually due to severe food group and or calorie restriction. Okay, and the third layer to add with this whole thing is the duration and time spent dieting. So it's not just about the calorie restriction and the food group restriction, but how long you're doing it for. This is probably one of the most frustrating, frightening, and confusing behavior changes a person may experience while attempting to diet. Binge eating, right? How many of us, and not just binge eating is different to snacking over your calories, but how many of us have felt guilt and felt shitty? This is what this whole podcast is about, is dieting chronically, but also feeling guilty for going outside of that, and then that can kind of perpetuate the cycle as well. That chronic dieting type of attitude of I must always be on a diet. So, those types of experiences may be something that you are experiencing personally because your calories are too low. They're just too low for your individual needs. Another reason, is perhaps that you're excluding food groups that you actually enjoy eating. So it's not just about under consuming calories, but also maybe you've been excluding too many things that you like and you are miserable eating what you're eating, and that can sometimes lead to binging and grabbing things here and there. Usually, and also as well, micronutrient deficiencies, so not eating enough of the right stuff, can also lead to binge eating cycles. Sodium deficiencies, not adding enough table salt to your meals can actually then lead to snacking, constant snacking, because you're craving these foods because your body needs to replenish your sodium stores. And this is all usually because of poor education surrounding food choices, or even so, taking advice from a coach who isn't actually a coach, or just says they're a coach, or a random unqualified influencer on social media who has perpetuated the idea that they are, or the person, the client, is only allowed to consume health foods for fat loss. I have seen some doozies. I have seen some doozies. Meal plans from coaches that only have clean foods, that also exclude a ton of micronutrients that the person actually requires in their diet, and then a ton of supplements that they don't require either. And it's no coincidence that these same coaches are just not qualified or not up to date with their qualifications. And they don't like being called out, and they don't like being called out either. So I don't often do that. I won't post things that people are doing, but I'll certainly talk to the individual about it. And the client usually finds out eventually that the person is displaying poor practice, really. And you know what? This is so much more common than you would think. This is happening all of the time in the industry. I've seen influencers in their bio that state that they're, for example, an actor, a fitness influencer, a model, all of the above. And there's nothing in there about being a qualified nutritionist, having any sort of qualifications, having anything under their belt with regards to study. Nothing. You can't find a scarish of it. And yet they're giving out unsolicited nutrition advice, and they may even own a supplement brand. Wild. And that's the thing, as I've said in previous podcasts, there is nothing. There's nothing in place. There's no sort of legislation preventing people from bringing out supplements that contain just hogwash, and they can definitely get around this by using statements such as may do this, may have this effect. And legally, they don't have to list the full ingredients either. It's wild, isn't it? People who are unqualified in nutrition are even able to produce supplements and sell them to you online and sell you a lie. And this is where we see that jumping on bandwagons with fad diets and shitty coaches that aren't actually coaches is a serious issue in the industry. And this is not because I want clients. This is because I don't want people going to the wrong sources of information and education. Anyway, I get very passionate about that in most of my podcasts, to be completely honest, because it becomes more and more frustrating the more you see it. So this whole clean eating, you must only eat clean foods. No. A balanced diet, as I've said previously, okay, should look like an 80-20 split, with 20% of foods consumed coming from some processed sources, whilst ensuring to keep total saturated fat intake below 10% of your total calorie intake. Okay? Pretty easy to do. Pretty easy to follow that. And with this shitty information that's being put out there, this is where negative relationships with food and they eventually progress, okay, to binge eating patterns, guilt for eating certain foods, misinformation, so then they start spreading it to their friends as well, where the cycle can repeat itself if calories and or food choices or variety are not adjusted accordingly. That's a problem. It's a serious problem. There are literally coaches out there causing eating disorders or disordered eating patterns in people, and it's so difficult to reverse it and convince them of otherwise. At times, if a person if a person may be struggling with alcohol addiction or consuming alcohol frequently, this is another topic, they may justify the consumption of alcohol with reducing total calories in other areas of their life. So this is where people are chronically dieting to make up for their alcohol consumption. So it's another common behaviour witnessed alongside calorie restriction is the overconsumption of alcohol and underconsumption of solid foods. It's a serious problem. This feeds back into the concept of micronutrient deficiencies, as I mentioned previously, and often whereby deficiencies will be more prevalent in those consuming large amounts of alcohol, either in singular, semi-frequent bouts of binge drinking, or frequently in smaller amounts. Firstly, due to the inhibited absorption of micronutrients when consuming alcohol, it really does have an impact on your gut and how your gut absorbs nutrients. But also due to the lessened consumption of total food volume and fibrous filling foods when consuming alcohol. So, when you have alcohol, you feel you don't often, some people will eat, but some people won't eat. And so then you're probably not even eating enough food in general to be able to get micronutrients from things like fruits and vegetables. And you're not even going to absorb it properly if you're drinking quite a lot in a sitting or over a prolonged period of time. And even so, it takes time for that alcohol to get out of your system. So whatever's in your gut, tract at that point in time is going to be impacted by the alcohol, or certainly in your stomach, is going to be impacted by the alcohol consumption itself. This is where alcoholism poses a risk for potentially malnourished individuals as well. And as we now know with recent changes to government guidelines, no amount of alcohol is good for you. I will have this disagreement with absolutely anybody. No, I'm not the alcohol police. I'm not going around saying everyone needs to quit drinking. But please stop telling me, oh, just a little bit's fine, it's good for you. It's not. No, the fact of it is, no alcohol is good for you, okay? There are some things in life that are shit for you. Vaping, smoking, drinking alcohol, it's not good for you. There's no benefits. There are certain things like, there are particular tiny little things like flavonoids and the like and in alcohol, but they're also in fruit, okay? So it's like there's no excuse for trying to consume alcohol to get these micronutrients that might be in, for example, wine, you know, and even with things like beer, you know, people talking about hops and things like that. Same effect comes from eating things like rye bread or just, you know, wheat, for example, whereby, you know, making them from these particular types of foods, probably logically just eat those foods instead of consuming the alcohol, which isn't actually digested or certainly processed as well as what normal solid foods are. Alcohol is not considered one of the major macronutrients, even though it technically is a macronutrient on its own. It's not considered an essential nutrient because it's not required in the human body, whereas there are, you know, 48 other essential nutrients that are. So I'm very passionate about alcohol. I grew up with and around large consumption of alcohol in my direct vicinity. And I can tell you that witnessing that was enough for me to be able to eventually get away from it and get out of it and start a new life. So, and often too with this alcohol consumption, usually there's this guilt of the total calorie consumption. And so then the person will then, you know, almost compensate in subsequent days with calorie restriction. So barely eating for days because they overconsume their calories from alcohol. And that's not, again, that's not the answer. And this is where, you know, so sorry, I've just said the same thing again, but, you know, it doesn't mean coaches can make the drastic call to demand a client completely quits drinking altogether. However, reducing alcohol consumption for the benefit of your physical and mental health is always recommended. So I won't say stop, but I will say reduce. For anyone listening to this podcast currently who's drinking alcohol or does drink alcohol, you can reduce. You can reduce from where you currently are. I absolutely assure you, you can. Just try it. Please try it. Some other impacts of chronic dieting, onwards from that topic. Loss of quality of life, social interaction, family time, and intimate connections with others. Not to mention missing out on foods you enjoy. And you should not feel guilty for enjoying some of these in moderation. Okay, so much the same as alcohol. I'm not saying moderation is, you know, what does moderation look like? It's different for different types of foods, right? So for example, there's recommendations. You know, alcohol, it's like, you know, no more than 3 standard drinks a week, right? And even that, if you can reduce that down as well, fantastic. If you're only having a couple of wines, you know, every couple of months at special events, awesome. If you can go without, if you can go dry for a few months, awesome. Just try. And with things like, it's different with foods, right? So things like chocolate, okay, things like processed food, if you have small amounts of them daily, it's actually not going to hurt you. There's no significant evidence to support that. If you're keeping your saturated fats under 10%, okay, if you've got that 80-20 split, if you're hitting your fiber goal, if you're hitting your other macro goals and you're getting your fruits and vegetables in as per the requirements and recommendations, if you haven't listened to my micronutrient and my fruit and vegetable podcast, please do. But if you're ticking all those boxes, it's okay to fill the gaps with some processed foods. So it's important to know that having flexible meals out with family, okay, doesn't make you a bad person. Just these are just special events. As long as if you've got a goal that they're not happening every single weekend, and that's whereby, you know, maybe that was your original undoing anyway. Feeling alienated and rejected socially, but also missing out on milestones and social events because you're anxious about the foods that will be on offer. So this is the downsides, right? You know, we've all felt that. We've all been in a position where, you know, there's been an event, maybe it's a special event, maybe someone really close to us, and we've rocked up and we're like, you know, I can't eat the food you're eating. And it feels shit. You can't have the birthday cake. Maybe you can have the birthday cake. Maybe it's been months since you've had birthday cake. Maybe it's okay to have the birthday cake. Maybe just let yourself, unless you're in comp prep, you know, unless you're doing an MMA fighter or you're a powerlifter trying to make weight, maybe just have the birthday cake. Having irrational fears of certain food types and obsessions with clean eating, okay? So this goes back to that whole concept of possibly being taught at one point that that's the only way to go. Assuming that consuming only clean foods are the only way forward for your fat loss goals. Super common as well, certainly for those who haven't received an education or worked with a coach long term. There are also serious mental health impacts such as severe food and exercise obsession, anxiety, depression, and even serious eating disorders which may develop over time if chronic dieting behaviours are not addressed swiftly. So on the final topic, how can you shift your thinking? Coming from someone who gained 30 kilos, I'm 30 kilos up at my heaviest. okay, from a state of anorexia. And I don't really like to talk about what I was because that's a past self. And I don't like people aspiring to get there either because I was very sick. I actually looked a lot older than I currently am now, and this was 10 years ago. I can say wholeheartedly my life became richer when I stopped obsessing and worrying about eating more food when it was to achieve a positive outcome. In fact, more than one. And my life quality simply improved after finding a way to love and respect food again. And I get really emotional talking about this because I remember how awful my life was when I was under that control of thinking that I couldn't eat more food. It was just frightening. It was the most frightening feeling in the world. And now knowing that I'm not stuck in that position anymore and I can eat more food and it's okay and nothing bad's going to happen. And it's going to have so many positive impacts on my life, physically, mentally, on my performance, my physique, everything like that, the way I feel about myself. I'm so much more confident than I was when I had anorexia, okay? Now, this is speaking from personal experience. That paragraph is definitely from a personal standpoint. So how do we begin to take the first steps towards shifting thinking around consuming sufficient calories and a well-balanced diet, including some foods that we enjoy? How do we find that sweet spot? Mindfulness and self-love is where we start. Although as a nutritionist, I'm not qualified in psychology, professionally, I'm not able to treat mental health conditions, but I can say that it's okay to forge self-love, self-respect, practicing daily self-care, and it can make the world of difference to the way that we treat our mind and bodies, especially when it comes to our food choices. Often we can reach for extreme dieting techniques as a means of self-punishment. We know that. When in reality, what we require is balance, self-respect, and compassion. Patience and kindness with ourselves, taking a step back from the daily obsession with our bodies, celebrating small wins and finding gratitude in small moments, appreciating our bodies, appreciating the good things about us, the things that we love and enjoy. And if you're not there yet, it's okay. You can get help for this type of stuff as well. Often the way that we treat ourselves internally can surface in what we do externally. So much of preventing the cycle of strict restriction and binging is also improving the conversation you have with yourself and challenging the idea that you've got in your mind, you've got this idea stuck in your mind that you need to punish yourself or take extreme measures. Challenge yourself on that, okay? If you hear that voice going off, nip it in the bud. Stop buying into fad diets, okay, and supplements that promise quick fixes and quick fat loss and all that type of jazz, really extreme diets, low calories. You look at the meal plans and it's just like, holy shit, this is just next level. No, I'm never going to be able to do this. No. They've never worked before, have they? They might have worked for a few, weeks, but are you still on it? Are you still on it now? Are you still able to, or are you able to go back to it? You haven't been able to stick to them, these extreme measures, and you've only felt miserable after attempting to and feeling terrible for failing. You don't have to feel like that. Give yourself an opportunity to see dieting as a phase you go through for a set period of time, but also look at incorporating foods you enjoy into your dieting phases. This is why I love tracking macros, because it teaches people how to incorporate foods they enjoy. Yes, it's not viable for everybody, but this is what I'm really good at. So I like to specialize in this. If you think you need a meal plan, find a coach who does meal plans. 100%, I totally agree with that. But I like working with people who want to learn. And that's something that then is a gift that you can have forever. Stop rushing yourself and your results, okay? It's not meant to be an overnight process. Why are you in such a rush? And if you're in a rush and you realize that when you're in a rush, it only ends up working out worse, maybe being in a rush isn't the best idea for what you're trying to achieve. Your mind and body will thank you if you take your time. Consider whether or not your calories, okay, are too low, and obviously then referring to calorie intake being that binge eating cycles, are counterproductive to your end goal. So if your calories were too low and, for example, you start binging, that's going to only be counterproductive for what you're trying to achieve. So maybe just consider, maybe they're too low. Maybe I need a bit more food. Perhaps a more conservative deficit might be a more sustainable and manageable approach to your fat loss goals. Your small steps daily in choosing to slowly increase your intake back to your maintenance calories will be of benefit to your mind, your body, everything that you experience down to your core. increasing, especially if you've been dieting for a really long time and you're really scared of doing this, trust me, it is like putting a life source back into your body. It's like putting yourself on charge and you feel like you can go again. Possibly assessing as well whether or not your current, calories are not just too low, but you're also restricting food groups. So there's two topics that come into this. It's not just the restriction, okay? It's not just the low calories, but also the food choices. Maybe you're not incorporating enough of those fun foods. Remove the fear around increasing your calories slowly, okay? It's not so bad. Please stop panicking about it. I remember the feeling of when someone told me to increase my calories slowly. And again, like, this is not me saying everyone needs to do it, because by no means is this psychological advice or dietary advice for everybody. But I'm talking about if someone has given you the advice, if you've got a psychologist you're working with or a coach you're working with and they want to slowly increase your calories, take a big, deep breath and just think about the fact it really isn't that scary. I promise it's not that scary. If anything, you will just experience some incredible things from doing so. Slowly but surely, I'd recommend doing so with the help of a professional. I don't think that someone who's been struggling with chronic dieting should be doing this alone. You'd be surprised how much your quality of life will improve when you do so, and the amount of calories you can probably get away with eating without gaining body fat, to have that maintenance level is astonishing. A lot of people don't realize they can actually eat quite a lot of food. Look at incorporating smaller amounts of the food you enjoy into your diet daily. This can often assist with preventing feelings of deprivation from certain food groups and feeling restricted, as I said previously. So not just maybe you're excluding food groups, but look at just slowly. I'm not talking about all at once, just adding little bits back in here and there once you've figured out, okay, I'm not eating a lot of the foods I enjoy. And obviously ones that fit your macros well and your calories well if you are tracking. But if you aren't tracking, that's another thing too. Maybe you need to take time away from tracking, which I'll talk about in a bit too. If you consume a small amount of food that you enjoy daily in a controlled manner, you're far less likely to reach for larger amounts of this long term. It's true. I have had clients previously who are like, no, I can't do that because then I want more. And that's probably because you have deprived yourself for so long. However, this will be a gradual process for some, as obviously some foods may trigger you into disordered eating patterns. And as recommended previously, you may need to work with a professional who specializes in disordered eating before attempting to reintroduce those food items. So as I said, sometimes you need the help of a psychologist or someone who specializes in eating disorders. It's actually quite difficult to get into them, but rest assured, you will eventually get in and you will get the help you need. A major recommendation to take away from this podcast to help you moving forward with your chronic dieting habits is seek professional help from a qualified nutritionist or dietitian on a basic level for creating structure and establishing a healthier relationship with food. So we can cover the basics, okay? And I mean we can cover complex stuff, absolutely. Oh yeah, there's biochem, there's all sorts of fun stuff in there. I can go as deep as you like. However, if it is in relation to eating disorders or just really disordered eating patterns, that's out of our scope. Not necessarily dietitians. Some dietitians will absolutely have that in their scope, depending on where they specialize. But for example, if it's chronic dieting and that, what I really want to just kick this, absolutely go see a coach. Absolutely go see a nutritionist, a coach who is a nutritionist. If you're unsure as to whether or not your coach is correctly qualified in nutrition or dietetics, usually they will list their credentials in their social media bio or via their website. This is not absolute though, okay? Not everyone who lists them is telling the truth. Alternatively, they'll be able to provide you with their nutrition or dietary registration details upon request. There are national nutrition and dietary registries which professionals are required to register to in order to verify and validate their professional status and claim of such qualifications. Okay, so these exist for a reason, just like doctors have to keep their PhDs on the wall, right? Or, when they've got their medical qualification, it has to be on the wall there to be displayed. Technically, we don't have to display it anywhere, but if you ask for it, or if you look us up, you should be able to find us. It is crucial for you to do your research as to whether or not your coach is qualified in their field. You would be surprised how many people are currently practicing illegally in our field. Unfortunately, the number far outweighs, this is sad, those who are legitimately qualified, registered, and insured. People giving nutritional advice on the internet, there are more giving advice than are actually qualified. Oh, that just riles me up. Trust your coach. If your coach has mentioned that they believe that it is time for you to take a diet break, please ensure that you practice this transparency and adherence with the person that you are paying, okay? We're not trying to have power over you, we're trying to help you. Your coach is invested in your best interests and will often give recommendations to align with this, which yes, will challenge you, but in essence, their role and their goal is for you to reach yours. However, there will always be exceptions. You may need to seek the help of a professional psychologist if you are experiencing symptoms which are far more severe, such as severe binge eating episodes, symptoms of anorexia or bulimia nervosa, and extreme anxiety or feelings of shame or guilt surrounding food choices, obsession with your body weight or body image, and or obsession with clean eating to the point where it is consuming you on a daily basis. Especially if it's disrupting your daily life, crowding your thoughts and destroying your relationship with yourself and putting pressure on your relationships with your loved ones. Eating disorders, and I'm gonna just end this podcast with a really serious note, because anyone who has landed on this podcast and who's listening to it has got all the way to the end, who has struggled with chronic dieting and not being able to come out of it, okay, needs to hear these statistics. It's quite scary, but please just rest assured that this is why I do this. This is why I got into the role that I got into. I don't specialize in eating disorders, but I want to be in a position where I can at least influence people in a positive way to steer them away from that direction, because I didn't have someone like me in my life 10 years ago to tell me this, to give me this information. And there's a trigger warning for anyone who has an eating disorder. If you don't want to hear about the statistics, that's totally okay. You can finish the podcast now, but I honestly recommend listening to this last part, because I don't think people realize how serious the problem is. Eating disorders are responsible for incredibly high rates of death, suicide attempts, and suicide-related deaths in Australia and across the world. Queensland in particular has extremely worrying highest rates of suicide attempts in young people in Australia, especially in relation to eating disorders. And eating disorders are rampant and commonly onset amongst youth ages 12 to 25. That's when it starts. Mine started at 20. And probably actually earlier, to be honest, because there were some symptoms much earlier on in life as well, around the age of 6 and even up to the age of 11 and 12 where it resurfaced. So, and I didn't know, I had no idea. Anorexia, this is really awful and puts a lump in my throat. Anorexia has the highest rate of mortality of all psychiatric disorders. These are incredibly alarming and concerning statistics, considering there is not a lot of open discussion around disordered eating patterns or diagnosed eating disorders. So whether it be through suicide attempt and success, obviously, or through the mortality of just simply the illness resulting in death, anorexia has the highest death rate of all psychiatric disorders. All of them, the highest death rate, the highest mortality rate. If you know somebody who is struggling, okay, with an eating disorder, or if you are struggling yourself, you can contact the Butterfly Foundation with a free phone call line, 1-800-33-4673, 1-800-ED-HOPE, so ED-HOPE, or chat to them online at butterfly.org.au. Again, this is not something I had access to when I was younger. You're never alone in your fight, and there's always hope and light ahead of you. Please reach out for help, whether it is from a nutritionist, if you need help from a coach and you think, you know what, I've been dieting for far too long. It'll be the best decision you'll ever make. Chronic dieting is not something to be proud of. It's not something to stay stuck on, and your life will change as soon as you accept that it's okay to come out of that, and you don't need to keep flogging yourself the way that you have been. That's it from me. I'm looking forward to doing another podcast for you soon. Sorry about the seriousness of the last part, but someone needs to take it seriously, and there needs to be more discussion about this topic, which I will be addressing even further in coming podcasts. All right, thanks a lot. Talk to you soon. Bye.